Well, having talked about the music up through August of 1965, we now head into the fall of 1965. And in the second half of 1965, we can see the Beatles in December of 65 coming up with a double A-sided single. The first A-side of the two, and when they say double A-side, what they mean is that nobody, the A-side is the side of the record they want the disc jockeys to play. The B-side is the one that there's got to be another side on the record. A lot of times in popular music, there's a real negotiation about whose music gets on the B-side, because whoever's on the B-side gets paid just as much as the person who's on the A-side in some cases. And so, even if people never play the record, they bought as many of those records as they bought of the other side, right? So in this case, it's a double A-side because they're thinking that both sides of the record they would like to become hits, and doggone it if that's not exactly what happened. So on the first A-side, we've got John's Day Tripper, a song that went to number 5 in this country, number 1 in the UK at the end of 1965. And on the other side, we've got Paul's We Can Work It Out, mostly Paul. John adds a little bit of the center, the bridge there. But that was a number 1 hit for him. So here you've got a single like Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields, where both sides of the record end up being hits. Anyway, released in December of 1965, the song Nowhere Man was released off in February of 1966, so into the next year, going to number 3. That's going to be a great instance of something I'm going to call broken AABA form, and I'll spend more time talking about broken AABA form when we talk about Michelle in the next video. So for now, we can see that the Beatles are active with singles in the fall of 1965, ending up to the end of the year, and then into early 1966. Let's talk about the album Rubber Soul. It was recorded in October and November of 1965 and released in December, going quickly to number 1 on both sides of the Atlantic, the US and the UK. It continues the movement toward the artist model and the authenticity that we found in Help. The lyrics are consistently more serious, and the instrumentation becomes even more diverse than what we saw on the Help album. The breakdown of AABA forms and the turn to other formal types, as we talked about with regard to Help, continues here as the Craftsman model really begins to recede, so that you get refrains in AABA forms that start to turn more into choruses and contrasting verse-chorus kinds of pieces. You get this broken AABA form that I'll talk about very soon. A lot more contrasting verse-chorus forms, and even new forms that the Beatles haven't used before and won't use again, that kind of single solution kind of thing I talked about with regard to the artist model. So we can really see a real progression here from Help to Rubber Soul. The album songs now provide a chance to experiment. They're no longer just extra tracks. The album starts to be an entity in itself, more than a collection of non-singles. Now that may seem like a small little point, but it starts to show a shift toward a different kind of orientation that we usually locate with something like Sgt. Pepper a couple of albums later. When the Beatles recorded in the early days, up to this point, whenever they would go into the studio, every song they recorded was potentially a single. And the best of what they recorded was released as a single. Something else was put as the B-side of that record, and then everything else was put onto an album, kind of as, I don't know, also rans or something like that. A lot of great songs, but they didn't make the cut. Only so many songs can be released as a single, right? Well, now they start to get into the idea that the album tracks, they can actually take a little bit more liberty and experiment a little bit more with. And so the album starts to become something that's thought of as a kind of entity in itself, and not just a repository for things that didn't make the cut as a single. That eventually is going to lead to this idea of a concept album where the sum of the songs is maybe greater than any of its individual parts, and we can see that happening already here with Rubber Soul. I've said before that one of the great things about the Beatles' success is they took the commercial success they had, and to a certain extent they reinvested it in research and development. That is, that instead of just trying to reproduce the same kind of commercial success in the same kinds of ways, they actually took the the freedom they were granted as an act that at EMI was making more money than anybody on the EMI label at the time, and thus turned that into freedom to experiment. And when they experimented, they pushed the whole style of rock music forward as they were able to sort of do things that other lesser bands would never have been allowed to get away with. And so this is Rubber Soul is part of that process. Rubber Soul, by the way, is an album that John Lennon referred to as the pot album, thinking of Revolver as the acid album, although, as I mentioned earlier, Lennon and Harrison actually dropped acid for the first time in spring of 1965, and not on purpose either. Early LSD was available to people in the to doctors, psychiatrists, and people. It wasn't illegal, and they were experimenting to use it for a couple of different things: as a cure for migraine headaches, and as a cure for depression. And the government was trying to figure out ways to use it to get the Soviets to spill their secrets, and this kind of thing. And so doctors knew about it and would bring it to parties, and have little acid parties. And so the acid was slipped into the coffee of these two Beatles and their wives, and they didn't know what was happening. They left the guy's apartment because they thought he was starting to get a little bit weird, and by the time they got to this club they were going to, all of a sudden the room was exploding with flames, and they were in the middle of a full-fledged acid trip. So it wasn't like they were trying to have it, but they experienced it. They must have liked it. Anyway, Revolver ended up being the acid album, according to Lennon, which is interesting because most people think of Sgt. Pepper as being that record. After all, doesn't Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds stand for LSD? In fact, it doesn't. And in fact, that's actually a little late, Sgt. Pepper, for what's going on in the Beatles' lives and in their creative impulses. Let's talk first about the John songs on this record. Norwegian Wood, mostly a John song. Famously, the first use of the sitar by the Beatles on a track. It's an ABA form, and we'll come back to that a little bit later when we do a musical close-up. The lyrics, also very interesting. We'll come back to that. But in many ways, this song we can connect already back to You've Got to Hide Your Love Away, and we'll talk about that more when we get to the musical close-up. Nowhere Man, which I mentioned a little bit earlier, is a critique of the status quo. Who is the nowhere man? The nowhere man is the guy who puts on the suit and goes to work every day and doesn't realize his own individual potential, but does exactly what society makes him do. And he wasn't the only one offering a critique of the status quo. At about the same time, Dylan, of course, was doing that. Ray Davies of the Kinks. It's a broken AABA form, and as we'll talk about in the song Michelle in the next video, you get a kind of thing where it goes A, B, A, B, A, B, A, B, A. And so in other words, instead of getting a partial reprise, you get a whole series of partial reprises which kind of break down the structure of the AABA. And so that's why I call it a broken AABA form. It's not yet a verse, certainly not a contrasting verse-chorus form. It's a broken AABA. Another John song on the album, The Word. And guess what the word is? The word is love. Hey, I thought 1967 was the summer of love. No, apparently it was December 1965 when the Beatles are talking about love and the word and this kind of thing. So this is another one that kind of gives us a sort of pre-hippie, a preamble to some of the hippie music that's going to be coming a couple years off. A Girl is a very kind of conservative song in a certain kind of way. It's an AABA form. There's a kind of a distinct refrain at the end of each verse that might be thought of as a chorus. It's not entirely cut and dried AABA form. There's a vocal suggestiveness in this tune, and I'm going to be very careful that I don't offend anybody in talking about what happens in this tune. The Beatles were ones to try to get away with things. They always seemed to be really aware that there was a machinery that was making them famous, and they kind of liked to tweak it, and usually that was charming. And they tried to get away with things and see if they could slip them by people, almost like students trying to play pranks on their teacher at school. And in the case of this one, people thought, oh, well, what they're doing now is that in this song is when they say girl, you hear John Lennon do an intake of breath, and you think, oh, that's like him, sort of puffing on a marijuana cigarette, right? That's the thing that's scandalous about it. But that wasn't so much what was scandalous about it. What was scandalous about it, and nobody picked up on, was the background vocals during the bridge. sing the syllable T-I. Now if you take T-I and repeat it over and over again, you get a description of the female anatomy. On a song called Girl, they're singing this in the background of the bridge. They think it's hilarious. Nobody notices, right? So they actually sort of get away with it. They're not censored on the radio or anything like that. It just goes on, and they think that's fantastic. But it's an indication of the Beatles always kind of pushing back against the machinery of the machinery that's sort of keeping them afloat as commercial successes, something that never goes away, and maybe is one of the enduring, charming things about the Beatles' career. In My Life is mostly John, although the authorship of that is kind of disputed between John and Paul. It's interesting because in two ways. One, it's a use of a classical harpsichord. And we'll talk about this in just a minute when we get to the close-up on this. But it's also because it prefigures Strawberry Fields as being a song that talks about the Beatles' childhood or their earlier life. So we'll come back to that when we talk about that in the close-up. And then finally, the last John song on this record, Run for Your Life, a contrasting verse-chorus song that kind of plays at blues. Maybe the most interesting thing about this tune from a biographical point of view is it actually borrows a line directly from an Elvis Presley, a tune that had been recorded by Elvis Presley called Baby, Let's Play House. I won't tell you what that line is because it's copyright protected, but you can go find that on the internet. That'll be a kind of a fun detective game for you. It's not the only time John Lennon used a line from somebody else's song in one of his tunes, and we'll get to that song off Abbey Road. There's a hint for you in a couple of weeks. Let's turn now to the Paul songs. Drive My Car. Mostly Paul's song with lots of double entendres. Are you really talking about driving? Is it really a car? Ha ha ha. This kind of thing. So that's kind of what's going on. It's kind of a rocker tune in many ways. It's not very progressive from a stylistic point of view. It's pretty much what the Beatles have been doing for a while. You Won't See Me is a song that is interesting in that it uses that AABA phrase structure. You know, where you've got a line that uses the same music, a line that uses contrasting music, and a line that comes back to use the same music again, all inside of a verse, inside of an AABA form. And that also happens in previous songs that we've seen, Paul's songs, 8 Days a Week and Things We Said Today. So there's a kind of a connection. We could see Paul going back to some of the things he's done before. Michelle, we'll talk about in the close-up. Again, it's Paul sort of playing the role of the French folk singer. It relates to Yesterday, as I said before. It's a broken AABA. I'll talk about that in the next video. Also, I'm Looking Through You, another one which, as I promised earlier, I will connect up with the song from Help, I've Just Seen a Face. And then finally, a John and Paul song that was written together called Wait. This song appears on Rubber Soul, but was actually recorded during the Help sessions. It kind of combines verse-chorus form with AABA form and uses the volume pedal guitar, which we saw in the George Harrison song before that. So this one hadn't been used before, and so they put it onto Rubber Soul. There's a couple of George songs here. Think for Yourself, a song with slightly angry, maybe preachy lyrics. Features Paul on the fuzz bass, using a fuzz pedal on his bass to get that really buzzy sound. Again, we're talking about using experimental sounds and new sounds, and so here's Paul with the fuzz bass, a contrasting verse-chorus form. And a song I'll talk about in the musical close-up, If I Needed Someone. I think the first George Harrison song that you can say this is really just as good as a Lennon and McCartney tune. Here's George Harrison really showing that he's coming into his own as a songwriter to rival the success and the craft and artistry of his two buddies, John and Paul. One last song to talk about, What Goes On, a song that John wrote with Paul and with some help from Ringo, more country and western for Ringo to sing a contrasting verse-chorus form. So that's an overview of what's happening with these tunes on the album Rubber Soul. Again, we see an increasing move toward this more artist model and toward greater authenticity, a way of bringing in new instruments and also ways of bringing in different styles that hadn't been used before. So in the context of that, pushing a little bit farther away from the craftsman model towards the artist model. And we'll see, of course, more going on with the artist model when we get to Revolver and ultimately Sgt. Pepper. So in the next video, let's do some song close-ups of Norwegian Wood, In My Life, Michelle, I'm Looking Through You, and If I Needed Someone.